Imagine you had a Retopology guidance system that drew up all your Retopology. Not only would it be faster, but you would make zero mistakes, taking away the frustration and guesswork out of Retopology. Hi, I'm Vertis, a character artist with over a decade of games industry experience, working as an art director with many Retopology studios. By the end of this video, you'll be able to export perfect guide maps and tackle Retopology with perfect confidence. For best results, follow along step by step and download the 3 free PDFs I've made for you guys that covers everything you need to know in mastering Retopology. So let's dive in. A better methodology is what we're going to follow is to draw these out on our mesh first and then bring them into Maya. So if we need to make any changes, we can just do it on the draft and paint it and rub out certain areas. And we can actually physically deform this and test our geometry to see how it's going to perform. So it's a very small little hack that not many people do or not many people know about that we're going to follow along. So when it comes to painting layers, I'm going to start with a new layer and I'm just going to call this zones. So you can change the color of your brush. Yours might be on the left side, but you can press this little button and change the color. Also up in the top left, the colors here. Now, if we come into a brush called the paintbrush, BPA, this is going to be very useful for painting zones. So the first thing I usually like to break down, if you're experienced, you might not have to do this as much, but if you're entry level, it's good to get a deeper understanding of how we break up certain limbs in terms of UV in topology. So the first one is that we're looking for really major shapes, and you can use this on any form of character. Maybe it's a creature character with multiple limbs and all these different shapes and objects coming out. This process is very useful to get into the habit of. So the first thing I'm doing is looking for a simple shape, and the arm cylinder I can see here. I'm just going to shade that all as one continuous shape. These borders are going to be becoming relevant later. We're actually going to draw lines on that so we can have the best physical topology that we can make. I'll basically change the color and then start to draw additional zones. So obviously the torso is another very obvious cylinder. So I'm just going to paint that in. If you want to save time, you can be clever with it. So you can go to mask lasso and then just basically draw a torso shape and then just cut that out. And then what we'll use, just make sure it's all connected up here and then hold control, invert it. And then up in color, we can just come to color and then fill object. That should usually do it. Sometimes the layers are a little bit buggy. So if that is the case, what I do is I just zoom out with a massive brush and then just brush it consistently like this. Now, the added benefit of doing this process is that when we zoom in, we can actually adjust how we've split these limbs up. So say, for example, I want more bit contribution from the arm. I can press C here and just introduce a little bit more blue. And that means we can have a nice perfect edge. Now, the kind of decision making that I'm doing here is just trying to really find where the shape transitions. So obviously there's a massive shape transition in the corner here, and that's what we're aiming for. The other transition would be roughly around the top of the arm here. Now that's going to be useful when it comes to unwrapping. So if you imagine connected to the torso, if we had all this additional geometry, it's going to be very hard to unwrap, and it's not going to unwrap nicely. So this is a deep consideration for the kind of even textures that we're going to have. So that'll become more clear if you're not used to UVings, because we'll break it down into its integral parts. Next section is obviously the cylinder of the neck. So I just like to color that in. What I aim for is basically as soon as it starts to bleed off into the trap, that's where I terminate it. So just make sure. And the reason this is a really good process is that every character is going to be different. You know, some characters might not have traps. There might be fat there might be some other things, or it could just be like a crazy dragon creature. So it's really important to look around the mesh often and then just look for these really deep transitional changes. So another obvious one is separating the head from the neck. So this isn't the most difficult process. Here we just split the hip all the way down to the bottom of the ankle, invert that, and then I can completely fill it in with a color. If I control and click off to the side again, that's going to invert it. That's going to nicely set us up for the foot. So these can be considered your unwrapping islands, or the major parts where we're going to put insert seams. Also, won't forget the hand. Now at this stage, it's just about pressing C and refining the transitions. So you can press C either side and then just adjust how much each side is contributing to itself. So eventually this neck is going to unwrap as a cylinder really nicely, and just make sure we've got these incisions where the geometry changes shape. So here obviously the wrist goes a little bit higher up, so we can continue that cylinder shape, and then it terminates once it hits this sort of thumb thumb region. So it doesn't have to be an exact science. You can obviously move the quads after, but it's always nice theorizing it first, and also so you can see physically what sort of decisions we're going to make when it comes to retopology, because retopology can be a bit chaotic. So it's just nice to have this sort of rail system and guidance system that you can go along, and you know that you've taken the time to actually look and see where the best edges can be positioned. So we have our zone layer that we can turn off and on, and we can also change the opacity. So that's going to be useful when we later bring it into Maya for a guidance system. So for the time being, I'm just going to turn it off. And the next layer, I'm going to rename this as edges, or edge flow is a good one. Now we're not going to draw every single individual edge, but we're going to draw the most important ones. And as I draw them out, I'm going to explain why they're there, because it's really important to actually understand why you're making certain decisions, not just to copy someone or copy an image. Because when you get into the world of work as a character artist, you're always going to be making these decisions on your own. And if you're running up to the art director and asking all these questions, it's not going to give a good impression. So it's really important to understand the fundamentals of why we're doing certain things. And then you can go on to other characters in the full knowledge that you're actually approaching it the correct way. So I'm going to change this to a black, and you can use any color you want. The first one I usually do is something that is unavoidable, which is going to be the central line. And I'm not too fussy about how neat it is, especially with ZBrush. It's really difficult to get the center line because it usually doubles up. So I don't mind if this is very faint. I just know that that's going to be the center line, and then we can see how the geometry is going to look. If you want to be super fancy about it, we could change the mask here and then select a rectangle, and then we could draw a really, really small incision here. Maybe even make it smaller with Control and Alt, invert it, and then we can just paint that really dark. So loads of different ways of doing certain things. As you become an artist, you find these little optimizations that work a bit faster. So the first layer of lines we're going to create are going to be assisted by the zones we've made. So you can see it's a very nice broken down process. So I'm going to bring back the zones and then also record the edge flow. I'm basically going to draw over these sections. And these are going to be our major UV seams basically later on, but they're also really good animation and deformation edges. So first just go around and adjust the transition, and you see I can make these lines with full confidence because we adjusted these lines when we were painting it. So it's much harder to readjust and redraw a line than it is just to shade zones. So it's a really cool process where you can identify areas, like especially when you're doing a UV unwrap, and then just come on with a different system and draw on top of it. So again, I'm not fussing too much about how accurate it is. It's just laying the foundation. So go around and conclude all those borders. Okay, so once that's finished, I'm happy that I can basically hide those zones. We don't need it anymore. And this is going to be really fun because before you know it, you'll blink, finish these sort of tutorials, and you'll have a full low polyed character. Potentially might not even know what happened. It will just come out of nowhere. And so it's really nice to break things down like this and apply it onto different types of characters and different objects. So usually I like to start broad, like, so say for example, you're sculpting, you start with the biggest forms. When you're texturing, you start with the biggest forms. And if you're writing, you usually start with some kind of draft. So I bet everyone's really eager to get into the face so we can draw all these out, but that's probably the one of the last things we'll get into. At the moment, we just want to make sure we've got these major animation loops. They're going to be useful for body deformation when this gets rigged and starts wobbling and moving about. So some really key ones, especially on the front of the chest, is basically where the center is connected and goes all the way through the arm and then back down again. So that's going to be really useful because when we're moving this arm, say for example up here, or the climber analogy we were giving, basically once this moves, we have the pectoral muscle. The pectoral muscle is going to want to follow this arm. So what we have to do is we have to maintain a really decent silhouette. So it's important to have this edge loop because when this arm is stretching up, and also this shoulder joint moves physically because this clavicle moves upwards and the shoulder joint moves upwards. So sometimes the pec really stretches. So it's vital that you have this pectoral line on the inside, and that's why we draw it. So when those are missing and I see that in a portfolio, I can really tell that the person doesn't really know about animation, but thankfully we can draw that and we understand that now. The next level and order of importance is basically the bendy straw joint around the arm. So this is going to be rotating all the way around. Now, if you imagine with a bendy straw, for example, inside of a glass, we want this to rotate in all manner of directions so it can go into the user's mouth and they can drink the goodness that's inside. So it's the same with the arm. This is a full ball and socket joint that needs to rotate all around. So we need to get some nice geometry around that joint. And it's often something that people mess up, basically. So now that we've got that perfect seam, it's perfectly aligned to the inside of this corner and also somewhat the apex of the shoulder, but just enough so it's making this arm a perfect cylinder. We're going to draw another set of geometry around here. Now it's going to be very tight on the inside of the arm, and it's almost going to fan outwards in this direction. So basically you're trying to replicate this. Now with this, what it allows for is the addition of many loops depending on the animation team. If they come back to you and ask for additional loops, it's very easy to come in and just insert them, but it also assists for really decent geometry deformation. So first what we're going to do is just complete these loops all the way around the side of the body, basically like this. So anytime if you want to rub these out or readjust them, you can just press C and pick up the original grayscale version and then redraw it by pressing C again and then getting the black color. So I'm not very accurate, I'm quite painterly with it, like how I basically concept these things in. Okay, so we've got that really major important loops, probably one of the top most important ones. The next sort of seams we want to put through, I like to put just on the top of the trap, and it's going to lead down from here and split almost like a shirt seam. Now the reason that edge is super important is because when we're looking at the character from the front, you can see I've almost got it perfectly, but we want a really nice consistent edge which defines the silhouette of the character. So this major line is going to be very important. It's also good because it splits the backside of this surface skin and the front side, and then that's going to be really important when it comes to unwrapping. So we've got nice segments that we can take off. If you imagine you were cutting this model up and trying to lay it on top of a table, like pelt mapping or unwrapping something, then that's going to be super important. Do the exact same around the body. So for example, from the front, we want this internal line. That's also going to do the same sort of features. So I'm just going to draw this in. It's also important because when you're drawing these lines, they're going to be at 90-degree angles from the previous ones you've drawn. And then what that means is that we're going to have really nice square topology, which is important when it comes to retopology. So I'm just going to go around almost the silhouette of the character and splitting up these sections. Okay, so now we're moving on to another really important section of character deformation. And you'll see that I actually stopped when I reached the halfway of the arm, because the forearm's going to have some different geometry that's going to be important for when it comes to twisting the radius and the ulna, because underneath here you've got two bones that twist. You can see it when you rotate your own arm. But before that, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to draw across each of the joints. So from the inside of the elbow and the outside of the elbow, and just connect those together with one continuous line. That's also going to be very important. We're going to set it up similar to how we did with the shoulder joint. Is we're going to get this upper muscle, and it's basically at 90-degree to the back of the elbow, 90-degree to the inside of the arm. So we've got a nice even distribution of geometry. And what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be aiming on this section, be aiming for the inside of the thumb. So that's the radius, basically the radius side of the thumb. And we can draw this. It's going to twist, and we're going to go through techniques of how you can really easily create this kind of geometry, and you don't have to draw out each individual square, which can take loads of time. So after you've done that, I would leave it here because the rest can be filled in and assumed later. If you're willing to work it out, you can take the opposite side of the arm and work out where that's going to twist. So it's going to basically twist in this direction. So again, we've still got some more really vital edge loops that are going to help with maintaining structure when it goes through advanced levels of deformation. And that's basically when it gets the leg. So around this area, we basically want to create almost like an arching shape that brings these together. Now, that's really important if you imagine the character is doing the splits. I know it's unlikely that they'd actually do that, but it means that they can go through that range of motion. So when this gate opens up like that, it means it supports the inside of the leg. Also means that when one side moves forwards in this direction and then also the other side moves backwards, we've almost got these twin sticks that's giving that support to the silhouette. So this one's really important. It's going to save you when it comes down the line. Another major one, especially if you've got a character that's sort of naked out, just make sure you're splitting the leg away from the center of the pelvis. So it can get quite annoying when it comes to the inside up here because it gets very tight. We'll just put a lot of geometry in there. Also at the same time, it's worth squaring off the hip. So for example, I'm going to draw all the way across here. It's almost making like a pant line. And again, we're trying to adhere to where we can at 90 degrees. And the reason we like to keep this in squares is it means that we can just continuously add loads of geometry when it comes to divisions, because basically this area, if you imagine the leg is going upwards, it's going to have lots and lots of deformation. It's going to stretch quite a lot. So it's going to need lots of geometry to support that. It's got lots of twisting and compression. So wherever you need a lot of compression and animation information, you just basically want to have nice square joints. It's the same with up here and also on the forearm. So while we're also doing animation, it's important to contort to basically the shape of the object. So obviously the deltoid has a very defined silhouette. So sometimes it's useful. We're going to add some additional edges that just separate the deltoid from the main arm. So we're going to use things like the multi-cut and just different techniques to create this geometry. So we're getting the best of both worlds, which is the perfect deformation for the game, but we're also getting the perfect silhouette coverage to cover these sorts of silhouettes. Here I'm just going to split up the mesh just so it's nicely directed. I'm going to join these together, and then that means we're going to have some nice square quads. I'm also going to do the center of the hip, and the only reason we do it here is just so we know that we don't mess with this area. We don't kind of make them diagonal geometry, which I see often. Sometimes people like to get a little bit fancy with the abs and sort of like follow this direction. And it just means the geometry is really bad for the animators and it's not going to look when it comes to deformation. So with games, we really try and keep it as squared as possible. And we might take it all the way up to around this region. So the more squared and cylindrical you can make it, usually the better it is. And someone's going to be super impressed when they see this, that you've taken note of not just silhouette deformation and silhouette topology. That's what usually inexperienced portfolio creators make, is just a bit of topology that follows the silhouette and the contours of the model. What really defines a game artist from someone who's making topology is that they know their deformation lines and the importance of keeping these nice and gridded. So the hands is a nice easy one. Basically we're going to split this into the major shapes, so it's just splitting off the fingers as if you were cutting them off. With the thumb it can be different depending on how much of the joint is being presented. I basically look for the most simple cylinder, and it's roughly around here. That's going to separate the main palm from the cylinder of the finger. So just draw loops around here. As it's just a guide, you don't have to completely finalize it. It's not going to be make a difference. It's just for your own reference. And then the other important section is a line that's basically going to split the front of the hand to the back of the hand. That's going to be good for the front of the silhouette, of course, but it's also going to be really important when it comes to unwrapping. So if we split the hand perfectly in two, it means that we're going to have a nice even deformation when it comes to unwrapping, and one side isn't going to be dominant compared to the other or deform too much. So just splitting the hand all the way down like this. So remember that every line that we're drawing here is going to save a lot of time when it comes to retopology and a lot of pain with testing and reconforming things and just trying to work it out in quad draw. So with the neck, I'm splitting up similar to the arm. It's just looking for the side silhouette. May as well join it to the edge that we created here. Next we'll move on to the foot, the forever forgotten foot, and the thing that's always left till last. So this one, we're just splitting the bottom of the sole, and this could be a shoe, for example. And that's going to be separated nicely as a UV. Sometimes we even make it a little bit smaller because no one really cares about it, so it can take up less space. But the important thing is that you're splitting the toe, so there's this nice bottom half. Then when it comes to the ankle, we usually have a split down the back. So you can insert that here, and also we can insert additional loops that are just going to adhere to this corner. Again, wherever there's a really important joint. So for example, this foot is going to rotate forwards and backwards. If I draw it here, obviously there's going to be lots of flexion, and well, let's make sure we get the joint right. It's going to be pointing up and pointing down, depending on how flexible the person is. But ideally, we want a good amount of squared geometry so we can have nice compressions. So if I draw out geometry like this, whenever it starts to change shape, so it gets smaller on one side, bigger on the other, means it contorts to this kind of like deformation and it maintains nice. So wherever there's a joint, you usually have really nice broad loops. Okay, so putting that into practice, I'm just going to draw around the splitting edge around here, and I'm going to do the same for the top. And you'll see a very similar pattern, the same thing that we used for the elbow, and also the armpit joints, and also around the eyes and the mouth. It's the same sort of thing. We're just drawing a second set of edges along our original edge, and that's going to define how far our topology is going to reach outwards. So looking around the mesh, I'm happy that we have a majority of super major loops. You might want to replicate what we did on the front towards the back, just so there's a nice bit of consistency. This obviously depends on what character it is, that we can have sometimes more geometry or square this off so it's a bit more like squared and voluminous. You can also go around and just conclude any areas. So say for example on the front we don't have that silhouette, so I can draw that. Just depends how comfortable you are with creating geometry inside of Maya. So if you're new, I suggest basically drawing these all out consistently, so you always have a nice guidance system. So when it comes to drawing quads and we're working on the side, for example, we know that, okay, we can stop there. And if we're drawing one out here, we know we can stop there, because we've made all our decisions already from a really broad aspect, which is super awesome. So when you're up close and personal creating geometry, you don't have to worry about these things, continuously zooming out and zooming in. Another important one, I'm just going to separate the leg around here and split that off from the major torso, or basically the hip area. So this is going to come all the way around, and this could be used as a UV seam, it depends, and it's just going to finalize here. What you'll find, similar to the eye, in this area what you'll have is a lot of radiating geometry outwards, and that's going to be good for when it comes to deformation. And it's nice to draw this because we can almost concept our topology and see if it's going to work. So we can just draw very faint lines through the lines that we've already created. Now it's important to know that because you might have all manner of shapes. So for example here, obviously we understand that that's going to retopologize very nicely. It's just very simple in quads. Where it gets a little bit more complicated is maybe up here. So we've only got 3 sides. Now what we might have to do here is just create some advanced geometry, which obviously we're going to go through, but it might look a bit like this. And as you can see, if we make this kind of structure and concept it out, we've now got 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. So we've turned this triangulated geometry into some nice quad trickery. So there's loads of cool tricks that we're going to go through on how to amend this. Now, quite nicely, we could just keep that there, to be honest. You know, it's a solution that works. So I'm going to draw a very faint line and then just draw this across in this direction. That's going to give us a really nice shelf for our clavicle geometry and the back of our trap. And this is going to really deform impressively, to be honest. Just so you have some extra content, you know, we have an additional one here, this nice triangulated one. It's the same sort of technique we used on the lower shoulder. It's going to be very simple. It's just going to be a central line, and then we're going to faintly connect it and cross through our other geometry. That's going to create almost like the corner of a box or a cube, and we can do the same on the front and then also turn this into a bit of a cube. So all these strategies we can just pre-draw out, and it's going to save us so much time when it comes to this retopology, and also give us an enhanced amount of accuracy, which is going to be so important for your portfolios and impressing the person that you're going to be showing it to. Sometimes a little addition, what I like to do, and obviously you can have your own sort of workflows, but when you're in ZBrush, it's obviously very easy to see conformity and sort of shapes. What you can do is almost like Borderlands style, just sketch in little bits of form and structure. Then you can insert that when it comes to retopology, because when we put this into Maya, it can sometimes be a little bit hard to see. So very major shapes like the glutes, obviously we want to have that very good separation and also a good structure to that. So very faintly we can just go over it. And if it comes to it when we're drawing out quads, we'll accidentally see this or intentionally see this, and then we can try to follow that system. And then because we've drawn it perfectly to our mesh,
we're just going to get a very high quality low poly piece. So don't go crazy on it. Don't go into every single little contour. It's not going to matter that much because the normal map's going to do a lot of the work. Now, when it comes to the knee, sometimes people like to do a bit of fancy stuff. So, for example, we can draw 4 points on either end of the knee, draw a bit of a box or a gridded system like this, and then from these 4 points we can go outwards. Now that can sometimes be useful because when you're bending the knee, no pun intended, you can have really good structure obtained and maintaining the shape of the knee and this whole sort of like outer perimeter that we've drawn. So when you put more geometry, it might come across a little bit more rounded and perfectly shaped like the kneecap. But when we do bend this joint, what's going to happen is it doesn't usually just bend like a straw effect. We do have the kneecap, the mechanics of the knee, that bone actually stays in position, and we want that shape to be maintained. So sometimes it's useful to actually make additional bits of loop and geometry around that knee joint so that when it comes to the bend, the animator has a lovely amount of vertices and edges that they can play with and just change the deformation so they keep the structure of that kneecap. So if there's a freeze frame happening or a screenshot, the character is always going to look convincing and just like a human anatomy. So for the time being, that shape's going to be better. We're going to refine it more inside of Maya, but at least you know the concept of where this approach is going to get directed. Another important section, obviously, our toes are going to bend. So this one can be a little bit tricky. It depends on how big people's toes are and what sort of size their foot is. But basically you're going to be aiming for the standard fold. It might be off to the side ever so slightly because all the knuckles are aligned in a certain way here. So if when in doubt, just go along the side of the joint, and then we can wrap it around underneath and come up the other side. So if you imagine someone's barefoot in the game, it means that all the bending is going to happen in this sort of area. And just like the joints that we did with the shoulder, the elbow, the eyes, we're going to put another set of geometry around that. And that means we've got really nice loops ready for animation if there ever be required more. So I think that's about it. I'm not going to spend too much additional time in here. Obviously, we could forever be drawing to the extent where we actually completely draw the entire mesh. So at some stage when you're confident and ready to go, it's a really good time to just dive straight into quad draw and start to test these out. At some stages, it might be that certain particular things didn't work out or you need to change it, but at least we've got this guidance system that's going to save us so much time. And then at this point, I think it's safe that we can move on to the face and just explore a couple of the major loops that are around there. So now you've got the blueprint for successful retopology. It's time to put it into action. But just hold on, if you're using quad draw, you could be wasting hours and hours of time. In this next video, I'll show you my faster and more efficient way of retopologizing a character. Follow it step by step and you'll be extremely surprised how easy it was to create a full character. Or if you want to continue with this retopology guidance system, we can now move on to the head for this video.